Pontiac's War. Pontiac's conspiracy, or Pontiac's rebellion, was a war that was launched in 1763 by a loose confederation of elements of Native American tribes primarily from the Great Lakes region, the Illinois country, and Ohio country, who were dissatisfied with British post-war policies in the Great Lakes region after the British victory in the French and Indian War. Warriors from numerous tribes joined the uprising in an effort to drive British soldiers and settlers out of the region. The war is named after the Odawa leader Pontiac, the most prominent of many native leaders in the conflict. The war began in May 1763 when Native Americans, offended by the policies of British General Jeffrey Amherst, attacked a number of British forts and settlements. 8 forts were destroyed, and hundreds of colonists were killed or captured, with many more fleeing the region. Hostilities came to an end after British Army expeditions in 1764 led to peace negotiations over the next 2 years. Native Americans were unable to drive away the British, but the uprising prompted the British government to modify the policies that had provoked the conflict. Warfare on the North American frontier was brutal, and the killing of prisoners, the targeting of civilians, and other atrocities were widespread. The ruthlessness and treachery of the conflict was a reflection of a growing divide between the separate populations of the British colonists and Native Americans. Contrary to popular belief, the British government did not issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in reaction to Pontiac's War, though the conflict did provide an impetus for the application of the proclamation's Indian clauses. This proved unpopular with British colonists, and may have been one of the early contributing factors to the American Revolution. Naming the conflict. The conflict is named after its most famous participant, the Ottawa leader Pontiac. Variations include Pontiac's War, Pontiac's Rebellion, and Pontiac's Uprising. An early name for the war was the Kiasuta and Pontiac War, Kiasuta being an alternate spelling for Gaiasuta, an influential Seneca Mingo leader. The war became widely known as Pontiac's conspiracy after the publication in 1851 of Francis Parkman's The Conspiracy of Pontiac. Parkman's influential book, The Definitive Account of the War for nearly a century, is still in print. In the 20th century, some historians argued that Parkman exaggerated the extent of Pontiac's influence in the conflict and that it was misleading to name the war after Pontiac. For example, in 1988 Francis Jennings wrote, "In Francis Parkman's murky mind the backwards plots emanated from one savage genius, the Ottawa chief Pontiac, and thus they became the conspiracy of Pontiac." But Pontiac was only a local Ottawa war chief in a resistance involving many tribes. Alternate titles for the war have been proposed, but historians generally continue to refer to the war by the familiar names, with Pontiac's War probably the most commonly used. Pontiac's conspiracy is now infrequently used by scholars. Origins. In the decades before Pontiac's rebellion, France and Great Britain participated in a series of wars in Europe that also involved the French and Indian Wars in North America. The largest of these wars was the worldwide 7 Years' War, in which France lost New France in North America to Great Britain. Peace with the Shawnee and Lenape, who had been combatants, came in 1758 with the Treaty of Easton, where the British promised not to settle further beyond the ridge of the Alleghenies, a demarcation later to be confirmed by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, though it was little respected. Most fighting in the North American theater of the war, generally called the French and Indian War in the United States, came to an end after British General Jeffrey Amherst captured the last important French settlement, Montreal, in 1760. British troops proceeded to occupy the various forts in the Ohio country and Great Lakes region previously heavily garrisoned by the French. Even before the war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, the British Crown began to implement changes in order to administer its vastly expanded North American territory. While the French had long cultivated alliances among certain of the Native Americans, the British post-war approach was essentially to treat the Native Americans as a conquered people. Before long, Native Americans who had been allies of the defeated French found themselves increasingly dissatisfied with the British occupation and the new policies imposed by the victors. Tribes involved. Native Americans involved in Pontiac's rebellion lived in a vaguely defined region of New France known as the Pays-de-No, which was claimed by France until the Paris Peace Treaty of 1763. Native Americans of the Pays-de-No were from many different tribes. At this time and place, a tribe was a linguistic or ethnic group rather than a political unit. No chief spoke for an entire tribe, and no tribe acted in unison. For example, Ottawas did not go to war as a tribe. Some Ottawa leaders chose to do so, while other Ottawa leaders denounced the war and stayed clear of the conflict. The tribes of the Pays-de-No consisted of three basic groups. The first group was composed of tribes of the Great Lakes region, Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi, who spoke Algonquin languages, and the Huron, who spoke an Iroquoian language. They had long been allied with French habitants, with whom they lived, traded, and intermarried. Great Lakes Native Americans were alarmed to learn that they were under British sovereignty after the French loss of North America. When a British garrison took possession of Fort Detroit from the French in 1760, local Native Americans cautioned them that this country was given by God to the Indians. The second group was made up of the tribes from eastern Illinois country, which included the Miami, Wea, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, and Pianka Shore. Like the Great Lakes tribes, these people had a long history of close trading and other relations with the French. Throughout the war, the British were unable to project military power into the Illinois country, which was on the remote western edge of the conflict. The Illinois tribes were the last to come to terms with the British. The third group was made up of tribes of the Ohio country, Delawares, Shawnee, Wyandot, and Mingo. These people had migrated to the Ohio Valley earlier in the century from the mid-Atlantic and other eastern areas in order to escape British, French, and Iroquois domination in the New York and Pennsylvania area. Unlike the Great Lakes and Illinois country tribes, Ohio Native Americans had no great attachment to the French regime. They had fought as French allies in the previous war in an effort to drive away the British. They made a separate peace with the British with the understanding that the British Army would withdraw from the Ohio country. But after the departure of the French, the British strengthened the forts in the region rather than abandoning them, and so the Ohioans went to war in 1763 in another attempt to drive out the British. Outside the Pays-de-No, most warriors of the influential Iroquois Confederacy did not participate in Pontiac's War because of their alliance with the British, known as the Covenant Chain. However, the westernmost Iroquois nation, the Seneca tribe, had become disaffected with the alliance. As early as 1761, the Seneca began to send out war messages to the Great Lakes and Ohio country tribes, urging them to unite in an attempt to drive out the British. When the war finally came in 1763, many Seneca were quick to take action. Amherst's policies. General Amherst, the British commander-in-chief in North America, was in overall charge of administering policy towards Native Americans, which involved both military matters and regulation of the fur trade. Amherst believed that with France out of the picture, the Native Americans would have no other choice than to accept accept British rule. He also believed that they were incapable of offering any serious resistance to the British Army. Therefore, of the 8,000 troops under his command in North America, only about 500 were stationed in the region where the war erupted. Amherst and officers such as Major Henry Gladwin, commander at Fort Detroit, made little effort to conceal the contempt for the Native Americans. Native Americans involved in the uprising frequently complained that the British treated them no better than slaves or dogs. Additional Native resentment resulted from Amherst's decision in February 1761 to cut back on the gifts given to the Native Americans. Gift-giving had been an integral part of the relationship between the French and the tribes of the Pays-de-Hainaut. Following a Native American custom that carried important symbolic meaning, the French gave presents to village chiefs, who in turn redistributed these gifts to the people. By this process, the village chiefs gained stature among the people, and were thus able to maintain the alliance with the French. Amherst, however, considered this process to be a form of bribery that was no longer necessary, especially since he was under pressure to cut expenses after the war with France. Many Native Americans regarded this change in policy as an insult and an indication that the British looked upon them as conquered people rather than as allies. Amherst also began to restrict the amount of ammunition and gunpowder that traders could sell to Native Americans. While the French had always made these supplies available, Amherst did not trust the Native Americans, particularly after the Cherokee Rebellion of 1761, in which Cherokee warriors took up arms against the former British allies. As the Cherokee war effort had collapsed because of a shortage of gunpowder, so Amherst hoped that future uprisings could be prevented by restricting gunpowder. This created resentment and hardship because gunpowder and ammunition were wanted by native men because it helped them to provide game for their families and skins for the fur trade. Many Native Americans began to believe that the British were disarming them as a prelude to making war upon them. Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of the Indian Department, tried to warn Amherst of the dangers of cutting back on gifts and gunpowder, to no avail. Land and religion. Land was also an issue in the coming of the war. While the French colonists, most of whom were farmers who seasonally engaged in fur trade, had always been relatively few, there seemed to be no end of settlers in the British colonies who wanted to clear the land of trees and occupy it. Shawnees and Delawares in the Ohio country had been displaced by British colonists in the East, and this motivated their involvement in the war. On the other hand, Native Americans in the Great Lakes region and the Illinois country had not been greatly affected by white settlement, although they were aware of the experiences of tribes in the East. Historian Gregory Dowd argues that most Native Americans involved in Pontiac's rebellion were not immediately threatened with displacement by white settlers, and that historians have therefore overemphasized British colonial expansion as a cause of the war. Dowd believes that the presence, attitude and policies of the British Army, which the Native Americans found threatening and insulting, were more important factors. Also contributing to the outbreak of war was a religious awakening which swept through native settlements in the early 1760s. The movement was fed by discontent with the British as well as food shortages and epidemic disease. The most influential individual in this phenomenon was Neolin, known as the Delaware Prophet, who called upon Native Americans to shun the trade goods, alcohol, and weapons of the whites, merging elements from Christianity into traditional religious beliefs. Neolin told listeners that the Master of Life was displeased with the Native Americans for taking up the bad habits of the white men, and that the British posed a threat to the very existence. "If you suffer the English among you," said Neolin, "you are dead men. Sickness, smallpox, and the poison will destroy you entirely." Quote, It was a powerful message for a people whose world was being changed by forces that seemed beyond the control